Hello, everybody, and welcome to another MetaCell Presents webinar. I'm Giovanni from MetaCell, and here with me I have Joe from Senscapes. How's it going, Joe?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Gio.
Great. Thanks for making time. All right. So Joe is a neuroscience PhD candidate at King's College and a co-founder of Senscapes, and also a musician there, and is going to talk to us about the sound of our brain. And basically how he and his team or colleagues are making music and visual art from brain data, and explaining a little bit about why they're doing that. So you might be asking yourselves, if you have never heard of us, what is MetaCell? And I'm going to spend a few words on that before we go into the actual talk. So we're a neuroscience software company, and we build a lot of open source software for neuroscience data visualization and online data sharing, and tools for web-based modeling. Our main customers are universities, and that's actually how I met Joe, because we were doing a collaboration with UCL, and he was doing his master's at UCL at the time. And then we also work with industry, some pharma companies, and non-profits. All right, so enough about that. Poll time. So now throughout the webinar, we're going to do some polls, basically asking you in the audience some questions, just to understand a bit of the background in the room. And I'm gonna kick off the first one right now. So you should be able to see something coming up now. Well, the poll is open, and another thing to say while the answers are coming in is that you're gonna be able also to ask questions through the webinar software interface. So there's a little box that says questions. So throughout the talk, you can, if you have any questions, you can pop them in there, and then we'll take them at the end, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. All right, so votes are coming in, and I'm gonna give it another 5 seconds, and then I'm gonna close it. All right, and close. Okay, so mostly academia, industry, some, and a lot of other. Interesting to see what that other is. Maybe you can leave it in. I know that there's a questionnaire at the end, so maybe you can let us know of your background there at the end. But without further ado, I think it's time for me to pass the ball over to Joe, and you have now control of the screen share, Joe.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gio. So yeah, I'm gonna take you kind of through how we might try and understand neuroscience a little bit better by turning it into music and art. And often people kind of think about science and art as very different disciplines. How can we understand about the brain through something that's quite abstract and emotional, such as art? But actually, I'm going to try and convince you today a little bit that actually it might help us bring our attention closer to some quite important issues in neuroscience, like mental health, like interesting states of mind. And by using neuroscientific data itself, we can actually construct an experience that might help illustrate that experience that participants went through in studies. So just to introduce myself a little bit better, Gio already did a great job, but just to reiterate, my name is Joe Barnby. I'm a PhD candidate at King's College London in cognitive neuropsychiatry. And what that means is I'm really interested in how the brain might underpin a lot of our subjective experiences that we have. So actually, or in fact, all of our subjective experiences. And I'm really interested in finding evidence that connects our brain function to our phenomenology, to how it feels like to be us. And an offshoot of this is that I'm also managing director of Senscapes. And what we aim to do is try and take neuroscientific data from studies. In this case, we're going to be looking at psychedelia. And we use that brain data to make music and art to hopefully bring audiences closer to maybe some of the experiences the participants went through in those studies. So I'm first actually going to start this off by playing you a piece of finished work that we recently showcased at King's College. And this is going to be a piece of music and art that has been developed from neuroscientific data taken from people taking psychedelics itself. So I'm going to quickly play this in quick time, and let me know if any of you are going to find this difficult to hear or see, but it should be okay. I think we trial run it okay. So I'm going to play you this, and remember, everything that you hear is made from data specifically. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that, and everything you see is a manipulation as a result of that music. So this is all actually going to be available online at some point. But what you just saw there was sounds and pieces of melodies written from the data itself. And also the visual patterns that you saw were frequency distributions of the music across a membrane using kind of liquids and paints. And it's meant to analogously kind of represent, through symbolism, I suppose, artistic symbolism, maybe what's going on in the brain during a psychedelic experience. So today, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background about what EEG and rhythms of the brain are. I suspect if there's a lot of academic folks among you, you might be quite familiar with this as well. I'm going to take you through maybe some music and complex sound. Oh, what happened there? There we go. Can you all see my screen fine? I think you can.
Yeah, that was me. I clicked the wrong thing. Go ahead, Joe.
No problem at all. I'm going to analogously show you maybe how music and complex sound is a little bit similar to recording EEG and how we might analyze that. I'm going to talk a bit about who Senscapes are, what we do, some of our techniques, and our previous work, a little bit about a show that we did a couple of weeks ago in May, and also some of our future plans and maybe how we propose to continue this venture. So first of all, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background about what EEG is and rhythms of the brain. So it all starts with this German scientist called Hans Berger in 1924, and he was the first person to actually capture on neurons speaking to themselves in our brain, and actually he recorded something called the alpha wave. And what this kind of looks like is, in modern day science, it looks like a cap like this with a lot of electrodes that go onto the scalp, and what that's able to do is pick up the electrical activity that's coming off of our brain. And this is representative of some of the neural oscillations that might occur at the surface of our brain. So when our brain talks to itself, it will fire neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters will fire in a sort of rhythm. And what we're able to do is pick up the electrical signal from that rhythm and try and understand maybe when our brain is changing in activity, what that means for our subjective experience. And more recently, we've kind of quantified a bit better these electrical signals in our brain. So Buzaki in 2006 published a really interesting review talking about all of these different brain rhythms that we can identify through analysis. And you might have heard of some of these actually. So there's gamma and beta that might be quite indicative of kind of analytical or mathematical thinking maybe. Alpha rhythms, which tend to be quite representative if I had my eyes closed and I was just sort of doing nothing, or maybe if I'm trying to attend to something. Theta waves tends to be maybe if I'm quite relaxed, and delta waves are tended to be more associated with when we're sleeping or in quite deep states. Hopefully none of you will be exhibiting too many delta waves while you're listening to me today. And what we can do is we can take these electrical recordings from all around the brain, so all across the cortex itself, and we can break this raw electrical signal down into its component rhythms to maybe understand how the different rhythms are produced and what that might mean for what the person is doing at the time. So for example, if I'm doing an attentional exercise, maybe my brain will be slightly different in its function, and we can actually record this and take a look and try and understand a bit better about the neuroscience of that activity that I'm doing. And specifically, as we're using a case study of psychedelia, in this paper in 2013, the Psychedelic Research Group at Imperial College London found on psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, they found kind of a spread and a large difference in the activation of brain rhythms across the cortex. So we can see here that these highlighted regions are actually differences between people who didn't take the drug and people who did take the drug, so they can isolate exactly what psilocybin is doing to our brain while they're experiencing this. And as we can see, there's lots of different activation across the rhythms. And what we're going to try and do in Senscapes, and what I'm going to try and talk to you about, is how we can exploit these changes and try and translate them into musical and artistic form, so we can maybe understand a bit more about the subjective experience that these people were going through. So just a bit in summary about the EEG analysis, what we found, or what scientists found at the time, is that we can take a brain, maybe like some of your own, we can record a region of it, we can extract a raw electrical signal from this region, And then we can break this down into its component parts, and maybe that can tell us a bit about the function of what is happening in our brain at the time. Now I'm going to move and take a bit of a sidestep here and talk about music and complex sounds, and I hope through this to maybe argue why music and complex sound is analogously similar to this process that I just talked about before, by breaking down complex rhythms into their component parts. So this story actually starts with another gentleman from Greece this time, called Yannis Xenakis, and he actually invented the first idea of how we can break down complex sound in its component parts, and that's called granular synthesis. And his idea was all sound, even a continuous musical variation, it's actually just an assembly of larger, smaller sounds all put together in kind of a complex way. So effectively what he's saying is that any sound that you hear, even my voice, it's actually built up of a number of smaller building blocks that gives you this impression of a very complex auditory sound. And it's the same in music, it's the same anywhere. It's almost like when you hear an orchestra, you hear one piece of music, but actually that orchestra is broken down into all of its different component parts. You've got the violinists, you've got the brass section, you've got the conductor, and all of these things are working together to give you that overall impression of a complex sound. And so in summary, for complex sounds, we found that we can take a singer or a piece of music or something that we're recording. We can record it using hardware. We can get a raw audio file from that, which again looks like this sine wave. And we can break this sine wave down into its component parts using granular synthesis that Yannis Xenakis proposed originally in 1959. Now, this kind of moves us on actually to who we are in Senscapes. And what I'm going to try and show you is how the analogy between breaking down rhythms in EEG waves and breaking down sound are fairly similar, and how we can put these two things together to try and make something that's a bit more able to communicate the neuroscience of studies in an artistic way. So we're a neuroscience and art collective, and we try and communicate states of mind. So, for example, psychedelia in this case study, we're going to try and communicate the experience of psychedelia using the neural data of people that are in that study itself. And what we're really trying to do is balance the laden data that comes out of neuroscience experiments, and quite rightfully so, obviously, as that's a scientific process. But when we try and communicate that publicly and try and get people to connect with a neuroscientific concept, sometimes it's a lot easier to make that in artistic form, so that people can possibly connect with very complex bits of information in a lot more digestible way, and also maybe tap into some of the emotional empathy that we might have as humans to try and connect to another state of mind. And these emojis, again, haven't quite worked, unfortunately. I never seem to quite get this right. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that what we try and do is take the biological narrative of what people go through in these studies, so as in how their brain changes over time, and we try and match that to the musical and artistic narrative that we put into our work. So what we do is we create a profile, if you will, of exactly what the brain is doing over time, and we can do that by extracting data that I'll explain in a second. And then we try and change the music and the art and how that transforms over time based upon what we find in the data. So we really try and keep it rooted to the brain function. And this is just a little demonstration of who we are, really. There's myself on the right. There's also my other co-founders, so Stephen, Tim, and Abby. Stephen and Tim are sort of head up our data analysis section. Abby is the visual director, and I work on music, so I work on transforming the data into sound. And just to give a bit of context, that's us at Science Gallery last year in Dublin, where we're just sort of doing a proof of concept of how we might be able to do this in a live way. So as you can see there, Stephen's got his EEG hat on, and we've kind of got a pipeline in the middle here that feeds over to me, but I have a lot of music production software where I'm transforming that data into sound, and then that sound is fed over to Abby, who records it through the cymatic pad. And again, I'm going to go into this in just a second. So onto our techniques, which is probably what some of you have logged into to find out exactly how we do this. So what we try and do, as I said, we try and combine the ideas of these two eminent scientists and try and bring together their techniques into something that can communicate neuroscience data. So we take the brain, we take brain data, we record or take data from different parts of the brain over space and over time. So lots of different regions of the brain or lots of different sections of that region over time. So we take time slices. We take the raw signal from that and how it changes. And then we break this down into its component parts. We take the max difference, for example, between regions in the brain and placebo and psilocybin data. And we exploit that and put it into granular synthesis to turn into music. So how do we do this exactly with music? I mean, it sounds a bit esoteric how we can just take data and chuck it into a musical form. Well, if you can imagine a normal EEG pipeline, which some of you might not be familiar with, granted, all that means is that we take this raw data and we put it through a series of software processing pipelines just to analyze exactly how that data changes over time and space. And so we can have a very accurate representation of what is going on at the sensor level, so at the level that we're recording it at the brain. And what we get from that is we get a lot of different sine waves, effectively, of EEG activity. And what we can do is we can export those as files. We can export those as raw sound files. And we can put it into something a bit like this. So this is music production software that I use. This isn't an actual picture of the screen that I would be using live. This is kind of a representation. And what we see here is that effectively this is a granular synthesis. So this is a software version for granular synth. And what it is doing is we're able to add a clip into this thing that I've highlighted here for you. And we're able to look at that waveform of a raw piece of data. And actually I can show you an example of this raw piece of data right here. So I'm going to play to you now what it sounds like when we take EEG data and just, without doing anything to it, what it sounds like when we export it as a sound file. So this is actually an alpha rhythm that I'm playing you now. I believe it's from the frontal region of the cortex. I'm also going to play you a beta wave now. So as you can hear, it's not exactly that pleasurable to listen to. Some people do it in a very raw way. So as I say, some people have found a way to transform EEG data into sound in other enterprises. But usually what happens is that they'll play it in a very raw form. So they'll be able to take that file and just play it out straight as it is. But for us, we wanted to add a bit more human connection to it. And we felt that the sound that was coming out sounded a bit raw and a bit cold and distant. And when you hear that sound, it sounds interesting because it's a direct sound of what is happening in someone's brain activity, except that it isn't really formed into a way that you might be able to connect on an emotional level. So this is where granular synthesis comes in. So coming back to the slide, if we look at this part that's highlighted here, effectively the sound file will come up into this little window here, and I'll be able to see exactly what the waveform looks like. And from that, I can select tiny little time slices of it if I want to exploit it. And what this does here is it will break it down into different densities. And what that means is how many building blocks do I want to hear at any one time? So if I want very low density, actually there'll be a very small amount of complex sound coming through. And that might sound a bit thinner. It might sound a bit, a little bit more sparse compared to something that's quite thick that I just showed you, which is the full complex sound. And what we can do is we can manipulate the envelope of that complex sound, in addition to a couple of audio plugins just to maybe manipulate its reverb or its delay. And through that, we can make it sound a little bit more pleasurable into something that I showed you earlier. The first video that I showed you were all sounds that were created just from those sound files, broken down using this granular synthesis and put back together into something that can be melodic and can be mapped to MIDI notes. So what we do is we take this granular synth, we break the sound down, we put it back together into something that might sound nicer, all again using just the sound files from the data. And then we map that to MIDI notes. So once we've got the sound, once we've got the sound that sounds appropriate, I'll take that sound and I'll map it onto a melody that I've written and something that is going to reflect the biological narrative of the data. So for example, in the point of the data where someone on psilocybin was having a quite intense experience, we want to reflect that in the melody. We want to reflect that in the way that the sound is put across to people that are listening. And hopefully that can try and communicate a little bit more about how the data is changing without showing complex graphs or complex data algorithms. So then Abby takes this sound and she'll put it into her cymatic plate, which is effectively a membrane spread over a speaker, just like this. Again, this is from our Science Gallery Dublin venture. And what you can see here is that the cymatic pad is trying to mimic the EEG pattern that is changing over time as a result of Stephen's brain changing over time. And what will happen is that as the music comes out that's changed, as the sound files change as a result of his brain activity changing, the frequencies and the movement of that liquid on top of the plate will change as well. So you get an artistic representation of what is happening in Stephen's head and what is happening through the music that's been generated from that. And these are some other examples that I have for you. This is again using kind of gold paint and milk, I believe, on top of the cymatic pad. And this was actually using LSD data that we hacked at the AXNS Collective Hackathon in 2017. And what we were asked to do is take this LSD data, which was actually magnetoencephalography data. I always get tongue-tied with that. Magnetoencephalography data. And we can take that and we can hack it and we can create music and visuals from it. And as you see here, you get some really, really beautiful effects from the cymatic plate as a result of changing activity in the data and the music. So this brings us kind of onto the case study that I'm talking about in terms of our immersive show that we put on in May, so a few weeks ago. And for this, we worked together with quite a few partners. So we worked with King's College London, we worked with the Psychedelic Research Group, we worked with Science Gallery, we worked with Mind, the mental health charity, and we worked with a hardware company called Sova Audio, who provided the speakers to immerse people in this event. And what we really wanted to do is try and communicate the psychedelic experience and also try and communicate through that maybe some of the struggle that people went through in some of the studies where they had depression and they overcame depression as a result of their use of psilocybin. These are people that weren't able to respond to other treatments. Again, some people are really able to respond to treatments such as antidepressants or CBT therapy. But unfortunately, this group had tried that and it really wasn't working. So they enrolled in this trial for psychedelic studies, and they took psilocybin, and for a significant amount, it was really effective in alleviating their depression. And this, I think, was effective for about 6 months following. So what we did is we took the data from the 2013 study and we tried to take the narrative of what people might have gone through in the later study as they went through their depression, as they went through the psilocybin experience. And also something that really wanted to communicate was that psychedelics have become quite a popular thing, I think, recently in the literature. And this is kind of either for better or for worse. And while they hold a really useful understanding into how our mind might work and how we might process information and how our brain might process information and how that might change in someone who might have a mental illness and then come out of that. And it might create novel therapies for future use. Unfortunately, as a result of the hype, it can become misunderstood. It can become kind of misused and not necessarily grounded in the science. So we wanted to kind of present a really grounded, neutral approach to psychedelic science. And myself and Mittal Mehta have actually written a paper on this, and you can see the reference there if any of you would like to read that. And it's just a critique about maybe some of the field of psychedelic science at the moment, where we're at with the current research, and where maybe future directions should go. And so what we thought is, while this research is really useful for understanding the mechanics and actions of psychedelics, actually communicating that subjective experience is really difficult. If you try and say to someone, how's a psychedelic experience for you? And they tell you, and you haven't done it before, it will probably seem quite an alien thing to you. So what we really wanted to do is communicate a subjective experience based upon kind of reports from people who have been on psychedelics, either for therapy or from trip reports that we found online. And so just to give you, again, kind of just a brief background, psilocybin is part of the magic mushroom group. It's the active ingredient, and it was found in the 2013 study and also in the latest study with people with depression to have quite profound effects upon the brain, and it seems to have functional significance in terms of what it does to our brain. Again, these studies need to be replicated in different populations, but so far it seems like it does quite an interesting thing on brain activity. And what we did is we took the MEG data from the 2013 study from people who had taken psilocybin. We extracted the data from that, as I was talking about before, using a processing pipeline. We then transformed those raw sounds that I played to you previously using granular synthesis into kind of melodies, and we mapped them onto harmonic frequencies based upon the data. And using the data itself, we composed a piece of music and then mapped the visuals to that music as well. And what we did is we created an immersive art experience. So people came along, they sat inside this big cocoon that was built of white fabric with lots of speakers around the outside, and they sat in the middle. And the music was played through 3D sound all around them. And the visuals were projected onto the white fabric. So you were immersed in these visuals and this sound to try and give you some of the narrative that people might have gone through in these studies. And then afterwards, we had a discussion panel where we featured 2 neuroscientists, a therapist from the psychedelic studies, and also a patient who had been part of the depression psychedelic studies, and maybe just talking a bit about his experience and how that was for him, how profoundly or how unprofound the experience was for him. I think he had a very grounded approach to it, but that will hopefully be online soon for anyone who's interested. And these are some shots from that immersive experience. So you can see kind of people sitting in the middle here, completely surrounded by the visuals. And I think you can see in the top picture there, just the speaker kind of poking up in front of the fabric. And this surrounded people inside this cocoon to really give them an immersive experience of that music. And it was all located in a church in King's College, obviously not for religious reasons, but just because of the architecture, and the art gave a really kind of sense of scale, I think, of this experience that some people report as a result of taking psilocybin. So we wanted to try and capture this artistically, as well as trying to do justice to the data. So where do we hope to go from here? Well, we hope to do something with meditation data coming up. We're looking with a academic over here at KCL called Elena Antonova, and we're hoping to communicate the meditation experience. So we're working with the V&A eventually to try and communicate this experience of what it is to be in meditation. We're using data from participants who are expert meditators, and they've had their brain recorded through EEG, and we're going to try and communicate that through art and music again. We're also going to try and explore VR and AR technologies and work out how maybe that can help immerse people in an experience a little bit more effectively. We don't know yet, we haven't tried it, but we hope it's kind of got good avenues for future research. And also we're working hopefully with the London Sinfonia later on to try and communicate maybe ADHD and psychosis, something that's quite a ethereal experience, I think, if you haven't had it. And so we're going to try and help people maybe become a bit more in touch with what that experience is like, and try and bridge the gap between something that might be ununderstandable and make it a bit more understandable. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm really looking forward to any of your questions you might have. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, where we have a few videos. You can also find us on our website, www.senscapes.com. And yeah, I'll pass you back to you, Gio, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Joe. That was great. It was massively interesting, and the audio samples were mind blowing. In particular, the first track you were showcasing, and I'm sure people would like to know where they can get more of that. Clips. I saw you had some clips on Twitter, so that could be one place to check, right?
Yeah, so we have some clips on Twitter and our Instagram, and also our website. And our YouTube has kind of another track that we did on it, a full-length track that you can listen to using LSD data. And also a couple of clips from our psilocybin experience. But we're going to be releasing this a bit later in the year. We've got some, I think CNN and Wired are going to be doing a piece on us. So we kind of want to save it just for that, first of all, and then we're going to do raves. Yeah.
All right, so that sounds great. So people definitely go check out Senscapes Twitter, Instagram, the Facebook page, and the YouTube for more of the sound bites. And it was massively interesting to me as well, because I'd never actually listened to raw data coming from EEG or equivalent. I never actually listened to that, put straight into a waveform and kind of, so that was super interesting. Let's see. So now I'm going to take back control of the screen, and I'm going to show, we have another poll. So I just want to ask people to start asking questions if they have any, and while we do the poll, and then we're going to take questions right after the poll. So this poll is we're launching right now. It's asking what's your main research interest? So experimental neuroscience, computational neuroscience, audio visual art, or other. And I'm gonna give people some time to pick to see that this should tell us a little bit more what the background of the room is as well. We saw that we had a lot of people from academia in the room and some others and some people from industry, but this is interesting because it kind of cross-references the background in terms of the main research interest. And I'm gonna give it another 5 seconds, and then this time I'm gonna share the results that I mistakenly did while you were speaking, Joe. Yeah, there's a button share results, and I accidentally clicked on it while you were in the middle of it. So sorry for distracting you with that. But okay, all right. So I'm closing this one, and this time sharing the results.
Okay, got you.
So now, see, there's a lot of computational neuroscience in the room, some audio-visual art. Interesting breakdown.
Interesting.
Okay, yeah. All right, so I'm gonna go back to my screen, and I'll keep going with, yes. Okay, can you see my screen, Joe?
I can't. No, it's still on the poll.
Yeah. Okay, I need to hide the poll. Okay, software. Okay, so now it's a Q&A time. All right, so let's see some questions from the audience. I see a question here about did you put together these tracks starting from open data? Was basically in case somebody wants to go grab that data and some of the raw data. Is that open studies, or how did you go about getting a hold of that?
Yeah, so we were working quite closely with the psychedelic research group on this. And so the author of that 2013 paper sent us over the MEG data itself, actually. And I'm not quite sure if they have it on Open Science to share, but I have a feeling that there wouldn't be any reason why they wouldn't be able to send that over to you if you wanted to analyze it yourself, or if you wanted to play around with it.
All right, so that's interesting. Thanks for that. Thanks for the question. So there's another question from the audience asking, is there any information on ideas behind any semantic interpretation of the sounds generated? As in, probably what, is there any correlation between what the waveform is doing and what's happening in the experience of the person? Yeah.
Yeah. You're interpreting that as, I think how I interpret that question, is there any kind of, can you hear the difference in the music when the data changes? Is that what they mean?
Let's answer your interpretation of that, and then basically semantic interpretation of the sounds generated.
Yeah.
Give it your best shot.
Of the sounds generated. I need that clarifying just maybe a little bit more.
All right. So we have if whoever asked that question can clarify, we can answer that. But there's another question from the audience. If a participant was having a bad trip, did it mean that the final music result was a sadder music compared to a participant having a good trip? And how did the music change throughout the duration of the trip, considering it can last for hours?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we've taken this data for one person. And what we've done is we've tried to match changes in the brain as reported in the paper. So we worked very closely with the actual published paper in 2013 on this. So we wanted to have a look at what the most salient points were during the trip over time. And we wanted to have that reflected by trip reports and by subjective experiences that people report as a result of the psychedelic. experience. So sort of in the middle, I think something that people tend to report quite frequently is that in these studies, especially quite well controlled, is that sometimes they come across quite difficult content that comes up in their experience, so quite difficult emotional things that they might feel. And because they've got support around them, often after they've had that experience, they report that actually it was very difficult, but it was worthwhile facing that. So I think what we try to do is at the point that it was peaking in the data, we try to make that experience musically quite intense, and I think quite reflective of something that was quite challenging, I think, for people to come up against. And the third track in the sequence, so the sequence is actually made of 4 tracks, kind of documenting the experience of a trip. So it's coming up, it peaks, and then comes back down again, sort of an afterglow. And so actually, if I can play you a bit of the track, if you can share my screen, Gio.
Yeah,
I can actually
I'm giving you back control of the screen. You should have it now.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. So if I put this actually at the start of this video, this is actually the start of the third track. And what this is meant to represent is the peak experience, is something that might be quite emotionally heavy for someone going through this experience, as reported by people who went through this trial. So as you can see, what we try to do really is, oh, what happened there? Oh, okay. What we try to do is really try and capture that feeling of kind of quite intense experience. And as you can see, the art is a little bit darker. Abby's using kind of iron filings there and kind of quite dark liquid to try and represent that feeling of intensity, possibly awe that people felt during that experience or reported during that experience. So I think in response to that question is yes, in a nutshell. We try and follow the narrative of the paper in terms of the functional neuroimaging and also the narrative of the reports that people give you from those sort of trials. I think I've lost your, I can't hear you, Gio.
I muted myself because I didn't want to disturb the religious experience of listening to that awesome piece of music. So what I was saying when I was muted is that track was particularly intense, kind of gave me goosebumps and reminds me of some of the atmospheric, so some dark moments of Mad Max Fury Road, and that I saw recently. So yeah, it was super good. So very, very, very cathartic. And now in answering these questions, I think you answered some of my curiosities, in the sense that does that reflect the emotional state of the person that was experiencing, and you said yes, that you try to capture that when you put together the music. So that's great.
I think it's important to note that I think some criticisms that sometimes that we get is that we're adding quite a bit of artistic interpretation to this, and that's a completely valid. It's a valid criticism if we're looking at this from quite a purist point of view. What we try and do is build all the sounds. So every sound that you hear is built from the data. But we're also trying to add an element of artistic, subjective experience. And every time that you try and do that with subjective phenomena, you need to, especially in art, obviously in art, you need to transform that in some way that's going to be representative of an emotional state. And as I said, if we played you the raw data, we could do that over time. We could show you the raw data as it changes as a function of sound over time. But it doesn't sound that melodic. And when it comes to actually communicating quite complex and nuanced human experiences, it doesn't really get to the heart of it. So we try and do as little manipulation as we can. Obviously, when we're dealing with something that is quite intense and complex, you need to have some artistic interpretation to communicate that, for sure.
All right, so that's great. So it looks like we have a clarification of the previous answer. There was a question that was asked, and the clarification goes: so if I heard some drum bits from music generated, say with some uh, do schemes exist where someone listening to those sounds can derive some kind of meaning? For example, that person is sad. Um,
Yeah. So I think what like any musician, I think people try and communicate an experience, or like an author, you try and read when you read a book, you're going to come in contact with characters and experiences you've never had, but kind of told through the experiences of the author, and through that they're trying to communicate certain emotional and challenging um, things that people can feel from that. Now, you might not have ever had those experiences, and you might not be able to ever have those experiences in a book, for example, or even in the music narrative. But what we're trying to do is transmit kind of an emotional package that will be interpreted in a certain way. And we like to think that it's from the feedback that we've got from people who are in those trials, and also from feedback from the participants in that in May, actually, when we did this immersive event, it seems to have been able to really put people in the moment, and give them kind of a similar experience to what it was like for them to be in the trial. As I said, we had a couple of people from the trial there, and I think their feedback meant the most to us, because they sort of said this is really an interesting representation of actually what I was going through at that time.
Yeah, that's
Obviously, every
massively interesting to me. That now that you mentioned that, sorry to interrupt you, but since you mentioned it, what was the feedback from the people who were on the trials, and then they heard your music and saw the visual images? So that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, the participant in that trial who took part in it came back to us and it really represented their their feeling, or kind of represented their experience with psychedelics. So that was really meaningful to us. And actually, they're going to be using this music in future psychedelic studies, because they're quite interested in how it actually represents the psychedelic state. So it's quite flattering for us, I think, to have that used in future studies for people who are going through that experience, to have kind of a musical guide, which tends to happen in psychedelic studies. Whether you agree with that or not, a sort of a different methodological issue, I suppose. But the feedback from participants who were naive of whether they'd taken psychedelics or not before, they were saying that it really actually kind of gave them a moment of calm being in that, and they were able to really immerse themselves in it. Again, when it comes to interpretation of did this make me feel sad or happy, I suppose there's enough ambiguity there that we want people to take away their own interpretation of it as well. But we like to kind of provide some parameters where we feel we're leading people through. So we like to think we're taking them by the hand through this experience. But of course, as we're all individuals and we all have certain ways of connecting our present moment with our background, I'm sure a lot of people would have taken something different from
Got it. All right. So see if we have some other questions. A
it. Thanks
question
very much for.
goes, yeah, all good questions so far. And another question I see is, did you know how to make music before you started this project, or did you learn how to use the manipulation software in particular for when you started looking at this and decided to pick that skill on, or is that something you were already doing?
Yeah, so actually in between, so my undergraduate degree was originally in psychology and neuroscience, but then between that and my PhD and my master's, I actually had about 2 or 3 years where I was working as a producer effectively. So my background is in music production as well, and it's always been something I've really enjoyed doing on the side. So it's almost kind of something I've tried to siphon in as much as I can to my PhD, and just try and find a way to bring together music and science in some way. Um, I think it's quite important to communicate things that otherwise uh, is very quite complex and nuanced. I find music's a really good um, thing for me to kind of decompress. I think if I've been working with data or working with something that's quite analytical for quite a long time, um, and I guess just over the years I've developed that production skill. So it's absolutely something that people can pick up um, and do on their own. Like, for example, if you just own a digital audio workstation and happen to have Alchemy within that, which is a granular synth, you can do this yourself. But it might take some time to kind of work out how to make it sound in a certain way, or maybe manipulate the music so that it goes kind of the way that you want it to. But this project, I would say the musical style of this project has been quite different from my previous work. So this tends to be very ambient and soundscapey, and actually kind of a bit more aligned with where I've always wanted to go musically. So it's kind of a personal accomplishment as well there, I'd say.
Great. So yeah, I'd say I can relate to that, where we always try to turn our work into what interests us the most. Like the ideal word is when your interests and your work are the same, and then we do what we can to kind of increase that overlap, maximize that overlap. And so 100% can relate to that. Another question from the audience. So you mentioned that the studies, the data was coming from were kind of a trial for depression. So using psychedelics to cure depression. And can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the MEG data that we took actually was from the 2013 study that was looking at the effects of psilocybin in healthy participants. But we wanted to take the brain imaging data from that and use the narrative from people that went through a similar study but with depression. And so we wanted to combine the two, the data from one looking at the functional effect of MEG data on the brain as a result of psilocybin, and connect to the narrative of people that took psilocybin for their depression. In the same group, actually, the same group looked at both or conducted both studies. But that study was done, I think it published in 2016. The participants that had depression and took psilocybin to overcome that. It was an open label study. There wasn't any controls, but they did find that the small group of people that were resistant to other treatments did find a significantly useful effect for the majority of using psilocybin on their depressive symptoms. So they found that it alleviated their depression. Again, it's a very small sample of people, but the people that have talked about their experience doing that trial, it seems to have had quite a profound impact on their life.
All right. And how far away, in your opinion, are we from using psychedelics as cures for depression? So we're talking 10, 15 years from now. This is all obviously a wild guess, because I understand that, it has to go through drug approval, all that kind of stuff. So are we at the dawn of, the exploration, or is it something that is looking more and more concrete going forward?
So I would say we're not at a concrete stage yet. Absolutely, absolutely not. As I said, there's a paper that I've just published with my supervisor, Mittel Mehta, on this. That's going to go out in Frontiers in Psychiatry the next couple of days, actually, that talks about our current state of research in psilocybin and where we're at the moment in the research, and maybe what future directions we might have. And I think actually, in summary, I think there's some interesting evidence, definitely interesting and very valuable starting evidence to try and understand maybe how psilocybin is affecting the brain. And certainly we have reports of people with treatment-resistant depression, seeing how that might affect them in a really actually quite fundamental way. However, as we move forward from this, we really need to look at studies that have more controls, more active control treatment, so that we can kind of compare the psilocybin effect to another treatment. And so we can actually look at the significant difference psilocybin is making over something else. Because otherwise it's going to be very difficult for scientists to justify the use of psilocybin if we can't understand what the added value of using that is compared to, say, antidepressants, which are, again, incredibly effective for quite a lot of people, or CBT therapy, which is very effective for a lot of people. What is the special contribution that psilocybin is making here? And as I said, like in these small trials, clearly has a profound impact on people, but we really don't know why yet. We really don't know what the fundamental why it's having an impact on people is. And if we can explore that and understand that better, maybe it can start becoming something that's a bit more integrated into treatment. But I would say not. We're a bit of a way off that yet, and I wouldn't. Let's keep ourselves grounded in the data as we move forward. A very remarkable, interesting experience, but let's keep ourselves grounded in the data as we move forward.
Makes sense. So this question is from me. So what can we expect next from Senscapes? What can we expect to see next? What are you guys currently brewing for us, and kind of do you have any shows coming up, other experiences like the one you showed, the experience in the church, King's College, and is there anything else coming up following that up that you want to advertise a little bit more?
Yeah, so we've just got funding to do, as I said, a study with or a piece with meditation, so using expert meditators in collaboration with Elena Antonova here at King's College London. But again, very fetal stages of that study. I think we're still we tried to get the last one done in about 4 months, which was like a lot of work in a very short amount of time.
I can imagine.
Yeah, so it was very stressful at points, enjoyable but stressful. So I think we're going to leave it a bit, and then maybe towards the end of this year, maybe early next year, we're going to have another thing that we're hopefully going to have a bit more of a permanent exhibition, hopefully in the V&A.
Oh,
We've
nice.
got talks, put it in the V&A. We're going to have like kind of an exhibition that people can come into, sit down, and then walk out if they want to. But hopefully we'll try and communicate some of the meditation experience.
All right. So you're targeting towards the end of the year for the next event.
Yeah, I'd say wouldn't hold me to things change.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Also got a PhD to do at the same time, which is a bit tough. But
yeah.
Well, I think toward the end of the year, / early next year, will probably be yeah.
All right. So I think we're running out of time because it's 5 minutes to 5, and it's been great, I think. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. Thank you, Joe, for this beautiful presentation and talking to us about your work, which is massively interesting. I should still be sharing my screen, and I just want to quickly plug our next webinar, which is going to be on the 20th of July, and it's going to be titled Putting Neuroscience Data Online, which is something that we do quite a lot. So Stephen Larson is going to present that one. And then that's it. I think we're done. And thanks, everybody. Thank you, Joe, again for coming. And I really enjoyed today's presentation and having a chat with you and taking questions from people, all interesting questions. And that's it. I think we can wrap it up.
Thank you for having me. And thanks everyone for coming along and taking a listen. Any feedback you'd like to give, please feel free, and feel free to email myself or Senscapes if you have any more questions.
Okay, that's great. And if you don't recall, these are the contacts for Senscapes. So you can probably Google and go to senscapes.com or the Twitter account and ask any questions there. And that's it. I think we wrap it up. And this was great. Thanks again, everybody. And you'll find the recording of this available online right after the session. And then after a while, we do some editing. We upload it onto YouTube as well. So you could catch it there or send it to somebody that was interested but couldn't attend. All right. So thanks. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.